Thomas Whitehawk had been hunting buffalo for over 20 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw that cold October morning in 1987. The sun was just breaking through the Montana mountains when he spotted movement in the valley below. Through his binoculars, he could see a small herd of buffalo grazing peacefully near the river. Thomas was a skilled hunter who lived alone in a cabin deep in the wilderness. His grandfather had taught him the old ways of hunting, showing him how to track animals and respect the land. Thomas made his living by hunting buffalo and selling the meat to local restaurants and markets. It was honest work, and he was good at it. But as he studied the herd below, something made him freeze. Among the dozen brown buffalo stood one that was completely white. Not cream-colored or light brown, but pure white like fresh snow. Thomas had heard stories about white buffalo from his grandfather, who was part Cherokee. The old man had told him that white buffalo were sacred animals, blessed by the spirits. Thomas lowered his binoculars and rubbed his eyes. When he looked again, the white buffalo was still there. It was a young female, probably only 2 years old. She moved gracefully among the others, unaware that she was being watched from the ridge above. The hunter's hands trembled as he reached for his rifle. This hunt could change everything for him. Buffalo meat sold well, but a white buffalo hide would be worth thousands of dollars. Rich collectors from the city would pay anything for such a rare trophy. Thomas could finally fix his truck, repair his cabin roof, and maybe even take a vacation. But as he aimed his rifle and looked through the scope, something stopped him. The white buffalo looked up toward his hiding spot, almost as if she could sense him watching. Her eyes were dark and peaceful, filled with an ancient wisdom that seemed to speak directly to his heart. Thomas remembered his grandfather's words. Some things in nature are too precious to take, grandson. The spirits put them here to remind us that not everything belongs to us. The old Cherokee had died 5 years earlier, but Thomas could almost hear his voice on the wind. He thought about all the stories his grandfather had shared about the sacred white buffalo. According to legend, harming one would bring terrible bad luck to the hunter and his family for 7 generations. Thomas wasn't usually superstitious, but something about this moment felt different. The white buffalo continued to graze peacefully, her coat shining like silver in the morning light. The other buffalo seemed to protect her, forming a loose circle around her as they fed. For 30 minutes, Thomas kept his rifle trained on the herd. He could easily take down 2 or 3 of the brown buffalo and leave the white one alone. That would still give him enough meat and hides to pay his bills for the next few months. But every time he tried to squeeze the trigger, his finger wouldn't move. Finally, Thomas lowered his rifle completely. He sat back against a tree and watched the peaceful scene below. The white buffalo was playing now, running in small circles around her family. She looked so young and full of life. Thomas realized he couldn't bring himself to disturb this perfect moment. The herd began moving toward the forest on the far side of the valley. Thomas watched them go, knowing he was letting a small fortune walk away. But as the white buffalo disappeared into the trees, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. He packed up his hunting gear and walked back to his truck empty-handed. On the drive home, Thomas wondered if he had made the right choice. His bills were piling up, and winter was coming. He would have to find other ways to make money. But deep in his heart, Thomas knew he had done the right thing. His grandfather would have been proud. The white buffalo was meant to live free in the wild, not hang as a trophy on someone's wall. Some things were more important than money, and Thomas had just learned that lesson in the most powerful way possible. That night, as he sat by his fireplace, Thomas felt a strange sensation that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. He had no idea that his decision to spare the white buffalo would come back to bless him in the most unexpected way decades later. 23 years passed after Thomas first encountered the white buffalo. Life had taken many unexpected turns during those decades. Thomas was now 68 years old, his dark hair turned silver and his strong hands marked by arthritis. He had stopped hunting buffalo years ago when his eyesight began to fail and his joints grew stiff. The world around his remote Montana cabin had changed dramatically. Development had crept closer to his wilderness home. Housing subdivisions now dotted the landscape where elk used to roam. The government had built new roads through areas that were once pristine wilderness. Many of the old hunting grounds were now off-limits, turned into protected areas or sold to wealthy developers. Thomas now lived on a small pension and the money he earned from selling handmade wooden furniture. His arthritis made the work slow and painful, but he took pride in crafting beautiful pieces from local pine and oak. Tourists sometimes drove out to his cabin to buy his chairs and tables, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations about the quality of his work. But money was always tight. Medical bills had piled up after Thomas suffered a mild heart attack the previous year. His doctor wanted him to take expensive medications and visit specialists in the city. Thomas couldn't afford all the treatments, so he did his best to manage his health with home remedies and careful living. The loneliness was even harder to bear than the financial struggles. Thomas had never married, dedicating his life to the wilderness and his craft. His few close friends had either moved away or passed on. Some days, the silence in his cabin felt overwhelming. During quiet evenings, Thomas often thought about that white buffalo he had seen so many years ago. He wondered if she was still alive, still roaming free in the mountains. He had never seen her again after that first encounter, though he had looked for signs of the herd during his remaining hunting years. Sometimes tourists or fellow hunters would tell stories about buffalo sightings in the area. Thomas always listened carefully, hoping to hear news of a white buffalo, but no one ever mentioned seeing one. He began to think that maybe she had died years ago, or that perhaps he had imagined the whole encounter during a moment of hunger-induced confusion. One cold February morning, Thomas woke up to find that his truck wouldn't start. The old vehicle had been giving him trouble for months, but he couldn't afford to replace it. Without transportation, he was truly isolated. The nearest town was 15 miles away, too far to walk in winter weather, especially with his bad heart. Thomas called his neighbor, Bill Rodriguez, who lived about 3 miles down the mountain road. Bill was a good man who had helped Thomas many times over the years. But when Thomas called that morning, Bill's wife Maria answered with sad news. "Bill's in the hospital in Helena," Maria explained. "He had a stroke yesterday. The doctors say he might not come home for weeks, if at all." Thomas felt his heart sink. Bill had been his lifeline to the outside world, helping him with grocery runs and trips to the doctor. Now Thomas was truly alone, snowed in with a broken truck and dwindling supplies. For the next week, Thomas rationed his food carefully. He had enough canned goods and dried meat to last about 10 days if he was careful. The nearest neighbor after Bill's place was more than 8 miles away. Thomas knew he wasn't strong enough to make that walk in deep snow, especially carrying supplies. He spent long hours sitting by his fireplace, wondering what would become of him. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. He had spent his whole life in the wilderness, always self-sufficient and proud of his independence. Now, that same wilderness was becoming his prison. On the 7th day of his isolation, Thomas noticed that his chest pains were getting worse. The stress of his situation was affecting his heart condition. He knew he needed his medications, but his supply was running dangerously low. Without a way to reach town, he faced a serious health crisis. That evening, as snow began falling again, Thomas made a difficult decision. He would have to try walking to town, despite the risks. It was better to attempt the dangerous journey than to simply wait and hope someone would eventually check on him. Thomas spent that night preparing for the trek. He packed a small bag with water, energy bars, and his remaining heart medication. He planned to leave at first light, hoping to reach town before another snowstorm hit. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl outside, Thomas thought again about the white buffalo. He remembered how peaceful and majestic she had looked that morning so many years ago. He wondered if his decision to spare her life had been worth the financial hardship that followed. Tomorrow, he might learn whether his life of choosing compassion over profit had any meaning at all. Little did Thomas know that his greatest test was about to become his most unexpected salvation. The journey down the mountain became the most extraordinary experience of Thomas's life. The white buffalo and Her herd moved steadily through the deep snow, creating a clear path that Thomas could follow. What should have been an impossible trek became a manageable walk, thanks to the powerful animal's breaking trail ahead of him. Every few hundred yards, the white buffalo would stop and look back, as if checking to make sure Thomas was keeping up. When he fell too far behind, she would wait patiently until he caught up. The other buffalo seemed to understand their leader's purpose, following her commands without question. Thomas had been walking for about 3 hours when he began to feel chest pains. The combination of cold air, physical exertion, and stress was taking a toll on his heart. He stopped and leaned against a tree, breathing heavily and feeling dizzy. The white buffalo immediately noticed his distress. She turned around and walked back to where Thomas was resting, followed by 2 other large females. The 3 buffalo formed a semicircle around Thomas, blocking the wind with their massive bodies. Their warm breath and body heat created a small pocket of warmth that helped Thomas recover. Thomas sat in this natural shelter for about 10 minutes, amazed by the intelligence and compassion these wild animals were showing. He had spent his entire life in the wilderness, but had never witnessed anything like this behavior. It was as if the white buffalo truly understood that he needed help and was determined to provide it. When Thomas felt strong enough to continue, the white buffalo resumed her position at the head of the group. But now she moved even more slowly, seeming to sense that Thomas was struggling. The pace she set was perfect for his condition, fast enough to keep him warm, but slow enough that he wouldn't overexert himself. As they walked, Thomas began to notice something remarkable about the herd. Several of the buffalo showed physical signs that they were descendants of the white buffalo. 2 of the younger animals had patches of white fur mixed with their brown coats. Another had the same distinctive eye shape and graceful movement as their leader. Thomas realized he was looking at multiple generations of the white buffalo's family. She had not only survived and thrived, but had successfully raised children and grandchildren. His decision to spare her life 23 years ago had allowed an entire lineage to flourish. The emotional weight of this realization almost overwhelmed Thomas. He thought about all the times over the years when he had struggled financially, when he had wondered if his choice to spare the white buffalo had been foolish. Now he could see that his single act of mercy had created something beautiful and lasting. About halfway to town, the group encountered their biggest challenge yet. A massive tree had fallen across the road during a recent storm, blocking the path completely. The trunk was far too large for even the buffalo to push aside, and the surrounding forest was too thick to go around. Thomas's heart sank as he looked at the obstacle. There was no way he could climb over the huge tree trunk, especially in his weakened condition. The detour through the forest would add miles to his journey and take him through terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate in the deep snow. But the white buffalo had a different plan. She led the herd to a spot about 50 yards off the road where the forest was slightly more open. Using their powerful bodies and sharp hooves, the buffalo began clearing a path through the trees. They knocked down small saplings and pushed aside fallen branches, creating a passage that Thomas could follow. The work took over an hour, but the buffalo never showed signs of giving up. They worked systematically, with different animals taking turns at the front to clear obstacles. Thomas watched in amazement as these wild creatures essentially built him a road through the wilderness. When the alternate path was complete, the white buffalo came back to get Thomas. She walked right up to him and gently nudged his shoulder with her massive head, as if to say, "Follow me." Thomas almost laughed at the absurdity of receiving directions from a buffalo, but he obediently followed her into the new path. The detour took them through some of the most beautiful winter scenery Thomas had ever seen. Ancient pine trees heavy with snow formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead. The buffalo moved quietly through this sacred space, their hooves making soft, crunching sounds in the pristine snow. As they emerged back onto the main road on the far side of the fallen tree, Thomas could see the lights of town twinkling in the distance. He was going to make it. Thanks to the white buffalo and her family, he was actually going to survive this ordeal. But the buffalo weren't finished helping him yet. As they approached the outskirts of town, where houses began to appear along the roadside, the white buffalo made one final gesture that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. She led the herd to a spot where the road passed close to a small pond. Using her hooves, she broke through the thin ice at the edge of the water, creating a drinking hole. Then, she stepped back and looked at Thomas, clearly inviting him to drink first. Thomas knelt carefully beside the water and cupped his hands to drink the clear, cold water. It was the most refreshing drink he had ever tasted. As he drank, the white buffalo and her family waited patiently, showing the same respect for water that Thomas's grandfather had taught him was proper in Cherokee tradition. When Thomas finished drinking, the buffalo took their turn at the water. Then, the white buffalo approached him one last time, gently touching his hand with her nose in what could only be described as a farewell gesture. Thomas stroked her massive head, feeling the coarse texture of her winter coat and the warmth of her breath. "Thank you," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for remembering." As Thomas walked the final mile into town, the white buffalo and her herd disappeared back into the wilderness as quietly as they had appeared. Thomas looked back several times, but they had vanished completely into the forest, leaving only their tracks in the snow as proof that this incredible journey had really happened. Thomas reached the main street of the small mountain town just as the sun was setting. His legs were shaking with exhaustion, and his chest felt tight, but he was alive. Several people on the street stopped to stare at the elderly man who had seemingly walked out of the wilderness in the middle of winter. The first person to approach him was Dr. Sarah Chun, who ran the town's small medical clinic. She immediately recognized the signs of someone in distress and guided Thomas into her clinic for an examination. As she checked his vital signs and gave him warm tea, Thomas tried to explain what had happened to him. Dr. Chen listened with growing amazement as Thomas told his story. She had lived in this mountain town for 15 years and had never heard of buffalo being seen in the area, let alone a white buffalo. Most people would have dismissed Thomas's account as the hallucinations of an exhausted, hypothermic old man. But Dr. Chen was different. She had grown up on a Navajo reservation and understood the spiritual significance of white buffalo in Native American culture. She also knew Thomas by reputation. He was known throughout the area as an honest, reliable man who had never been known to tell tall tales. "Thomas," she said gently, "I believe something extraordinary happened to you today. But right now, we need to focus on your health. Your heart rhythm is irregular, and you're showing signs of exhaustion and mild hypothermia." Dr. Chin insisted that Thomas stay overnight in the clinic's small emergency room for observation. She called the larger hospital in Helena to arrange for a cardiac evaluation the next day. She also contacted social services to help Thomas figure out transportation and housing options while his truck was being repaired. Word of Thomas's incredible journey spread quickly through the small town. By the next morning, a crowd had gathered at the clinic to hear his story firsthand. Among the visitors was Jake Morrison, a local wildlife photographer who had been documenting animal life in the area for over a decade. Jake was particularly intrigued by Thomas's description of the white buffalo. He had never photographed such an animal, but he had heard rumors from other locals about white buffalo sightings over the years. Jake offered to drive Thomas back to his cabin and help search for evidence of the herd's passage. 3 days later, when Thomas was cleared by the doctors to return home, Jake kept his promise. They drove slowly along the route Thomas had walked, looking for signs of the buffalo. Near the spot where the fallen tree had blocked the road, they found unmistakable evidence. The path the buffalo had cleared through the forest was still visible, marked by broken branches and deep hoof prints in the snow. Jake took dozens of photographs and even found some white hairs caught on tree bark where the white buffalo had passed. More importantly, they found other people who had seen the herd. A couple driving to town that morning had spotted large animals in the distance and stopped to watch them through binoculars. Their description matched Thomas's account perfectly, including details about the white buffalo leading the group. Jake wrote an article about Thomas's experience for the regional newspaper, including his photographs of the Buffalo Trail and interviews with other witnesses. The story was picked up by larger newspapers and eventually reached a wildlife conservation organization based in Denver. The conservation group was fascinated by the account of a white buffalo leading a wild herd in Montana. They arranged funding for a proper scientific study of buffalo populations in the area, with Jake Morrison serving as the lead photographer and Thomas as a consultant. Over the following months, the research team confirmed the existence of a small but healthy buffalo herd living in the remote wilderness around Thomas's cabin. They captured several photographs of the white buffalo, now estimated to be 25 years old, and clearly the matriarch of her family group. The discovery brought unexpected benefits to Thomas's life. The conservation group paid him a modest fee for his consulting work and helped him access better health care through their insurance program. A television documentary about his story brought him a small amount of fame and additional income from interview fees. More importantly, Thomas was no longer alone. The researchers became regular visitors to his cabin, and Jake Morrison became a close friend. The story of the white buffalo attracted spiritual pilgrims and nature lovers from across the country, many of whom stopped to visit Thomas and hear his firsthand account. Thomas also reconnected with distant Cherokee relatives who had heard about his story through Native American networks. They helped him understand the deeper spiritual significance of his encounter and invited him to participate in ceremonies honoring the sacred white buffalo. On quiet evenings, Thomas often sat on his cabin porch and looked toward the valley where he had first seen the white buffalo so many years ago. Sometimes he caught glimpses of the herd in the distance, and he always felt a warm sense of connection to these magnificent creatures. Thomas came to understand that his decision to spare the white buffalo had set in motion a chain of events that reached far beyond that single moment of mercy. His compassion had not only saved one animal's life, but had preserved an entire lineage and ultimately led to the protection of their habitat through the conservation efforts his story had inspired. Now in his 70s, Thomas often told visitors that the white buffalo had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that acts of kindness and mercy, even when they seem costly at the time, have a way of returning to bless us in ways we could never imagine. The white buffalo had indeed repaid his mercy, not just by saving his life during that desperate winter walk, but by giving his entire life new meaning and purpose in his golden years. The circle of compassion had completed itself in the most beautiful and unexpected way possible.